what's your view on inflation then? So obviously, US inflation, headline CPI has been running at, around 7% or so. Most people expect inflation to start to head down over the course of this year towards like 3.5, maybe 4 even, due to base effects and so on. But eventually people do expect it to go down towards 2 in a few years, rather than staying, at 5 or 6. I mean, where do you stand in this debate?
I agree with, I think, the general impression that just from a base effect alone, and we see clear evidence that supply chain bottlenecks are starting to get resolved, like the number of ships waiting to be offloaded at the port of Los Angeles is way down. Tanker shipping rates from Shanghai to LA or New York are moderately down. So I think it's very likely that the year-over-year change in the CPI will moderate towards, let's say, 3 to 4%. But we do think that, so it's interesting because there are clearly structural disinflationary trends, the demographics being one of them, right? If you just look at the 10-year annualized growth rate in the labor force, it's a spitting image of the 10-year yield over the past 50 years. And that labor force is barely growing. Or if you look at the dependency ratio of people at working age or not versus not working age, we're going in the same direction as Japan with about a 10 to 15 year lag. And you look at Japan, right? I mean, rates are very, very low. Inflation is very low. Then you add to that, technological disruption, digitization, et cetera. So there are powerful deflationary underpinnings that I think will keep rates low and will keep inflation low over time. But they're offsetting forces now that really weren't there a few years ago. And one of them is, of course, a very tight labor market, a workforce that is feeling more empowered to work on their terms rather than the employer's term, and we see that everywhere. And housing, right? You look at the real estate market. The CPI accounts for real estate costs through owner's equivalent rent, which is just a survey of homeowners. But my understanding is that the actual growth in rental in rent costs are much higher. So you have these two structural forces that I think will keep inflation higher than where it otherwise should be. And so maybe that's going to be over the next 5 years, 3 instead of 2. And then the question is, what does the Fed do about that, right? So we're actually not that far from a fork in the road for the Fed, where if the yield curve continues to flatten, the 2s to 10s curve, it's at about 35 basis points today. It was about 150 basis points a few months ago. So that's flattening pretty rapidly. If at some point the Fed sees the curve invert, and that's not a prediction, but we have to think about the possibility. What will the Fed do, right? Will it choose to tolerate higher than desired inflation, or will it sacrifice essentially the economic expansion in order to push inflation down? My sense is, and again going back to the 1940s as the analog, is that the Fed will have no choice but to accept higher inflation. And if you think about it, debt to GDP is running well north of 100%. It's one of the easiest ways to reduce your debt burden is just to inflate your way out through negative real rates. And so that's the side that I would be betting on. It may not be a straight line from here to there, but I think ultimately my sense is that we're going to remain in a period of very low real rates, if not ongoing negative real rates. And that has a lot of implications for asset allocation in terms of choosing real assets over nominal assets.